Good afternoon and welcome to the BBC News at 1. A plane carrying one of Brazil's leading football teams has crashed in Colombia, killing most of the 81 people on board. But miraculously, several people have survived, including players from the Chapecoense football club in southern Brazil. The team was one of the country's recent football fairy tales. It was promoted in 2014 to Brazil's top division for the first time and was travelling to compete in the biggest game in its history for a place in the top South American Cup final. The plane was en route to Colombia and crashed in a mountainous area just outside the city of Medellin. Joe Wilson reports.
Medellin, Colombia, and the search for survivors. The aeroplane which crashed had been carrying 81 people. Survivors in single figures. Amongst those on board, the Brazilian football team Chapecoense, which had become one of the most talked about in the land. This, their club badge.
As soon as the sun comes out, we'll start working on the transport of the bodies to Medellin. There, we'll be expecting relatives, members of the club's executive board and several foreign journalists who were here to cover what was going to be a joyous occasion and has ended up being a tragedy. Our city and the whole of Colombia's heart go out to everyone involved.
Chapecoense had been travelling to Colombia to take part in the final of the Copa Sudamerica. These pictures are from the departure lounge. The team was only founded in the 1970s and yet had the chance to win a continental competition. It was to be a famous occasion. These images on board the plane show bearded defender Alan Ruschel and goalkeeper Danilo, both initially reported to have survived. Danilo later confirmed to have died. In the past few minutes, a Colombian news agency released pictures reportedly of a sixth survivor, understood to be a Chapecoense player. Yet so often Brazil had seen this team celebrating this season. In fact, it was the kind of rags to riches sporting story that the whole country shared in.
If you look at the internet, everybody was being so Chapecoense, so Chape, which means I am a Chapecoense supporter. Even think teams, people from other teams. And all of a sudden for this to end this way is just heartbreaking, and it will be that kind of stuff of legend. People will remember where they were when this happened. It's like a Munich event for us.
On the fringe of a Munich airport lies the wreckage of an airliner.
The Munich air disaster of 1958. 23 people died as Manchester United travelled back from a match in Belgrade. It's become part of English football history and a key part of Manchester United's identity. And today Manchester United expressed the club's sympathy on social media, whilst Real Madrid paused in their training session for a minute's silence. All these players know air travel from match to match, from country to country. It's part of their profession. So why did this aeroplane crash? It was operated by the Bolivian charter company Lamia. Bolivian aviation officials have suggested an electrical fault. There are also reports that the plane may have run out of fuel. As the search for survivors continued, Atlético Nacional, Chapecoense's opponents in the cup final, requested that the title is awarded to Chapecoense. And on Twitter, back in Brazil, the home dressing room, with squad members who did not fly. Joe Wilson, BBC News.
We can talk now to our correspondent in Sao Paulo, Daniel Gallus. Daniel, an absolute tragedy for the country. Tell us about the latest on the rescue.
Well, there is still a lot of information coming in from the local press. A lot of it hasn't been quite confirmed. There was the news that another player had been found. There was news that another crew member may have been found as well, but we're still waiting for more confirmation. The death toll right now, as we have it, is either 75 or 76, but we still have to get the final list of all those on board. The plane had 81 people on board. This tragedy is one of the biggest of the kind in the history of Brazilian football, and there's been mourning declared here in Brazil by its president. Also, a major championship final that was occurring tomorrow between two other teams here in Brazil has been cancelled, and the whole nation is just stopped and is watching right now the tragedy that is unfolding. It's quite hard to understand what Chapecoense will do and what this city, what this town will do in order to get its football to survive after this huge, terrible tragedy.
Daniel, thank you. Daniel Gallus there. Russia says the Syrian army has made a breakthrough over the last 24 hours of fighting in Aleppo. 3 areas in eastern Aleppo have been taken from rebels, effectively cutting their forces in 2. The situation on the ground for civilians has been described this morning by a United Nations spokesman as almost beyond the imagination of anyone not there. And the UN is now saying that up to 16,000 people have been displaced. Our correspondent in Beirut, Thomas Morgan, now reports.
Frightened and distressed. Women, children, families fleeing in the hope they can find a safer home. As Syrian government forces and their allies continue their assault, aiming to regain the east of the city that's been under rebel control for the past 4 years, thousands of civilians have been leaving East Aleppo over the past few days. The United Nations estimate that at least 16,000 have been displaced, some moving to rebel-controlled areas. However, pro-regime media have been reporting this morning alone 30,000 have fled to government-controlled zones. And civilians speaking to those news outlets have been scathing about the treatment they received under the rebels. You had to be well connected to receive good treatment, this woman says.
We are thirsty and hungry. We've been beaten. They used to beat us in our own homes.
Food, aid and medical supplies have almost completely run out in the east of the city. The Syrian civil defence say they only have 2 days of fuel left, with several reports of civilians burning anything they can in an effort to keep warm. With no sign of any aid arriving anytime soon, the humanitarian situation in Aleppo is getting graver by the day.
We are helping on the western side. If people are fleeing, we want to get into the east. But you all have seen how hard everybody is trying to make that happen. It's a slow motion descent into hell.
By cutting off supply chains, the regime's tactics have been to force the rebels to starve or to surrender. But their fighting spirit remains. Either we go to heaven or to victory, says a leader to his men. The battle for Aleppo is not over just yet. Thomas Morgan, BBC News, Beirut.
The chairman of the Football Association has said the sport is facing the biggest crisis he can remember. Greg Clark told the BBC that the game had to address the failings which had led to the current abuse scandal. Well, our sports correspondent Richard Conway is at Wembley for us now. Richard.
Well, Greg Clark talking inside Wembley this morning to reporters and talking about the moral responsibility that he feels the FA now has to get to the bottom of these historical child sex abuse claims that have come forward over the past 10 days or so. We've heard very powerful testimony from former players talking about the abuse that they suffered at the hands of a number of coaches. 5 police forces now investigating claims, but Greg Clark, in talking about what it is doing and the FA is doing, talking about the internal review that they are conducting. Kate Gallifant QC will lead that. She will make recommendations in due course about what the FA knew and when and how it can prevent such situations from happening in the future. But Greg Clark was asked specifically today where this stood in terms of crises that the FA has faced in the past.
I think it's certainly the biggest one I can remember. I think the moral consequences of failing to deal with some of these issues in the past we must get to the bottom of. We've got an inquiry led by an external QC who will make sure we know the facts. We've got the annual audit of our child protection procedures going on in the next few months, so we'll check on what's going on. But we're certainly taking it extremely seriously.
Now, also this lunchtime, the government have been responding to an urgent question posed by the opposition in the House of Commons about measures being taken to safeguard children within sport. And Karen Bradley, the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, saying that she's spoken to both the FA, the PFA, to ensure that everything is being done to provide a safe space for those players who want to come forward and report abuse, but also to talk about safeguarding measures for children. The Sport Minister, Tracy Crouch, has written today, we're told, to every national governing body, not just in football, across all sport, to remind them of their responsibilities. And there is an emphasis now that the mistakes, whatever they were of the past, cannot be repeated again in the future.
Thanks, Richard. Now, when Theresa May came to power, she promised to crack down on what she called the irresponsible minority of big businesses. And today, the government is publishing its plans to curb executive pay and to tackle boardroom abuses. But it's been accused of rowing back on proposals for workers to have more representation in boardrooms. Here's our business correspondent, Jonty Bloom.
Rowlandson Knitwear was founded in the 1930s, but last year it changed. Now the staff own 60% of the company. Not only that, but workers' representatives meet once a month to discuss how to improve business. And workers have a representative on the trust, which runs the company. The boss loves the idea.
The major decisions, including those major decisions around pay that are made in the business, they have to be approved by the trust. So we have one of our employees, the employee-nominated individual that's on that trust.
And the workers' representative says it makes a real difference.
Give people a sense of value, make people be cared more, which we feel really strongly about is caring. And people more now, they seem to embrace it and they just feel like they feel part of a business.
But hopes that could be the future for British business look likely to be disappointed. Although the government says it wants to bring down the gap between top executive pay and that of average staff, it's not gone as far as many hoped. So it's looking at forcing companies to publish the difference in earnings between the chief executive and the average employee, and introducing binding votes on executive pay packages by shareholders. But the idea of giving workers a role in deciding top bosses' pay has been watered down.
It can't be a case of a glorified suggestion box or an advisory council or somebody else on millions of pounds pretending to be a worker on board. It's got to be somebody who can represent the perspective and experience of working people.
But with the gap between top pay and average earnings widening, even the bosses' organisation admits things have to change.
There should be some restraint in top bosses' pay. The fact is, over the last 18 years or so, the FTSE is roughly where it was then, and bosses' pay is up 300% over that period. There is no question too many bosses are being rewarded for failure.
But with the likes of Sports Direct not paying the minimum wage while the boss made millions, and BHS going bust with a massive hole in its pension fund, restoring trust in business is about more than limiting top executive pay. Jonty Bloom, BBC News.
Private notes made by a political aide have once again been snapped by a photographer in Downing Street, this time relating to a meeting about Brexit. The handwritten notes included the phrase, "have your cake and eat it," in response to the question, what's the model, and unlikely in reference to Britain's membership of the EU single market. The government's denied the notes are an outline of its thoughts on Brexit. Here's our political correspondent, Tom Bateman.
It was just another day of Downing Street meetings. The Conservative MP and party vice chair Mark Field was with an aide. Earlier, as they left the Brexit department next door, a notepad carried by his staff was photographed. It appeared to address a possible stance on Brexit talks. The note said, "We think it's unlikely we'll be offered the single market." They went on to ask, "What's the model? Have cake and eat it." And then, after a reference to the lead EU negotiator Michel Barnier, very French negotiating team. Since the vote to leave the EU, the government has faced calls to say more about its Brexit plans.
I'm proud to say we export cake.
The Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson said earlier this year he wanted to have our cake and eat it, a reference to getting the best trade deal without free movement of people.
Has an aide let the cat out of the bag?
I think the only cat around here is Larry.
There was less on show as ministers arrived for a meeting of the Cabinet. Downing Street said the notes did not reflect policy, and the Prime Minister wants maximum access to the single market and control over immigration.
I don't recognise the memo or the notes or its content. I'm part of many conversations as a member of the Cabinet Committee on Brexit.
So these were people that had just walked out of the Brexit department?
I don't know who it was and where they had these ideas from.
It can be easy to forget what you're carrying in front of the cameras, but there is a wider point to all this. The private planning going on here for Brexit is creating a very public vacuum into which it seems it's easy for virtually anything to get drawn, including the inky, handwritten notes of an MP's assistant. Labour called for more transparency, claiming Britain appeared to be heading out of the single market.
I think the government have got to come to Parliament and put their basic plan or opening position before Parliament. I accept there's confidential detail that they can't put before the House of Commons, but the negotiations will be ongoing.
Ministers have repeatedly said they won't reveal their Brexit demands in public, but a clue over the response from one EU leader today who said Britain wants to have its cake, eat it, and get a smile from the baker too.